Well, hello there. Today I am just drinking some water because I didn't feel like making more coffee. I've already had plenty of coffee today, so water it is. Today we're going to talk about two books. Both of them were popular. I found out about because of the r/fantasy list. But apparently the first one has been really pretty popular in booktube space, and I have some thoughts about both of these. So the first one is the Will of the Many. It is a 2023 book written by James Islington. I think overall I thought the book was generally pretty solid. There were some pretty interesting things about it. It uses a lot of tropes like hidden prince, the underdog goes to the top academy for magic users, leader, whatever, like in a lot of books. I get why it's popular, like having that sort of top academy. I know I actually used it in my series of stories for the Good Goddamn, where there's this top of the top type training program. It keeps portions of the stake low so that whenever you work on the entire series, you can continually crank them up without having to go to a world-saving event in book 2, because you're at this real low stakes interpersonal struggle, and it helps you build the character. But I mean, it definitely made me think about a number of books like Red Rising, The Locked Tomb, Poppy Wars, The Traitor Baru Cormorant, Lightbringer. I mean, there's a ton more. So it's a pretty well-trodden trope at this point. I mean, people clearly like it because there is that, there's always that enemy to lover chance to happen between some of the characters, and there's always you're rooting for the underworld, the underdog there. The world is the one unique thing about this is that it's a very Roman inspired book. Instead of being a fantasy world that takes place during the Middle Ages, it is a fantasy that takes place during the Roman Empire. And I think that's a nice kind of refreshing change of the scope a little bit. I think that was a good decision. The magic system is pretty unique. There's one book that it reminded me of, which I don't think is a very popular series. It was the Rune Lord series by David Farland. And if you haven't read that series, the first book is definitely very interesting. I think overall it's a pretty interesting. In the magic system is that in that series is that you can brand somebody with a specific feature. So like health, constitution, strength, eyesight, hearing, whatever, and that person loses it and goes to somebody else. And in that regard, it is similar with the Will of the Many, where it takes will away from somebody and it kind of generically improves everything. So while Rune Lords is very specific in what it does, the Will of the Many, the will that you give up is kind of everything. And the person receiving it kind of experiences a cumulative effect, and then they give some of theirs off to somebody else. And one of the things is it's also got that whole motive of I'm not going to use this magic and stuff like that, which I get the point of it, and I get why that's there, but I don't always think that's the best way to prove something about the character. I mean, in this case it makes sense because it ties into the hidden prince type trope. It kind of ties into the hierarchy of the entire world, which is very important. I mean, the Will of the Many is very much about a hierarchical society. You know, I've called out a lot of tropes in this one. I think that this book leaned very heavily on the tropes, and it kind of became a paint by numbers based off of that. That doesn't mean that he didn't do a good job of tying these tropes together into making a compelling story, or add tension, or any of those things. But it felt very kind of predictable, because you could just see where everything was going because it was following this trope. And I just, that really lost a lot for me. You know, I thought that it did a good job with having a different influence, but given how many tropes that were leveraged, I don't really know how accurate it was to Romanness any more than a fantasy book is accurate to medievalness. I don't really think it matters. It was just a structure to put the world in that would be unique. So the second book that I read is Empire of Silence, and it's a 2018 book written by Christopher Rauchicho. I think that's how you say his name. This book also has a lot of tropes. Again, it kind of wears them on the sleeves. I think that it does a little bit better job of making things feel unique, but it definitely feels like it's an ode to a number of sci-fi books. I kind of got the feeling of Dune, you know, especially because there's no computers in this future world. Everything is done by humans. You know, they call them logothetics and scholastics. And the priesthood, which is called the Channery, holds a lot of sway over this empire, which just feels like the Bene Gesseits. You know, they don't really have any power, but they feel like they're the Inquisition. I also really got a feeling of like the New Earth series, which, because of the kind of the style of the storytelling, I don't think that it was quite as unreliable narrator. I feel like this narrator is a little bit more reliable than the narrator of the New Earth series. I think that one of the big differences is that in New Earth, that main character feels that they're a hero, even though they're definitely not. And in this series, Harlan Marlowe kind of feels like he thinks of himself as a villain or an anti-hero or something. Definitely not a, you know, dyed-in-the-wool hero. He doesn't really. He's doing things for himself, like, and very intentionally, because he doesn't want to do certain things in the world. He finds them distasteful. You know, he has tried to do the right things, but he fucks up so much that it just ends up being worse than if he hadn't done anything. I also get a feeling that there's some Hyperion cantos in this series as well, with the extrasolarians. They feel very much like the ousters, and because of the way they genetically modified themselves, the way that they feel like an external boogeyman to this universe. Plus, the Earth has gone missing, which is a big part of the Hyperion cantos. Chantry claiming it will return definitely feels like it's somewhat related to the priest's story in Hyperion. And I think there's a little bit of a subtle nod to the culture as well. We're mentioning a neural lace. So, you know, I think that this is very much again, another trope-filled book, but that is an homage to science fiction. And in a lot of ways, The Will of the Many is similar to that. I don't think it is as bad, and I think it really leans into the but then approach to story writing, which is what the South Park creators, here's kind of a video about that.
we found out this really simple rule that maybe you guys have all heard before, but it took us a long time to learn it. But we can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words "and then" belong between those beats, you're f***ed, basically. You got something pretty boring. What should happen between every beat that you've written down is either the word "therefore" or "but."
Really suggest leaning into, because that leads to more expectation subversion, or at least allows you the option to pivot. And whenever you do something that feels more trope driven, it becomes an "and then," not a "but then." You know, he decides that he wants to do this other thing, but then he wakes up, 100 years later and on a totally different planet. He still has his ring, but then instead of using it, he decides to make a life on his own. And I think that really helps kind of separate these two books between The Will of the Many and The Empire of Silence. There's one feels like an "and then" or "yes and," this one feels like "but then," and more of a intentional moving away from what might be expected. This sort of writing is pretty common in a lot of early writers. I know this is not necessarily the first of either of these two authors' books. I realized as I was going through and getting books off my Kindle and backing them up, that I had read Islington's first book. Well, I did not finish his first book. I got through like 40% of it and just thought it was unfinishable. It was very predictable and paint by numbers, very trope heavy, and just made me think of better books. Well, I think that he is better with The Will of the Many. It still definitely really made me think of other books. And I don't blame them for doing this. I know I have, if you look at my books here, Misadventures of the Peanut Butter Boys, I call that like Scooby-Doo, but people are really high. And then Goat's Legacy, I got the idea from that book from thinking about what happened if Rand al'Thor had a kid and the kid had to clean up the mess that Rand didn't finish. And, I have similarities between the magic system between World of Time and this, but I kind of go off in a different direction. And I make it very clear that it works differently. But I think I wear my influences very, very tightly on my sleeves. And I think that both of these books discuss oligarchy and oppression in interesting, nuanced ways. One is from a conquered people's perspective, which I think is always important to have. I don't necessarily think that it was done as well as it could have been in The Will of the Many. I think that from the perspective of The Empire of Silence, where this person intentionally gives up his role in the hierarchy, I think it gives a lot more commentary on things, because it is where he ends up in the strata of society, and that he intentionally doesn't use any of his benefits. Whereas it's clear in the Will of the Many, the main character leverages every advantage that he had from his previous life to get ahead, and that ultimately is what allows him to get ahead. And I found it interesting that both of these books had gladiator portions that kind of catapulted them forward in their respective worlds. And both had their training from whenever they were youth, but they both got to that point for different reasons. One was trying to get enough money to buy basically his own freedom, and the other one was because he was about ready to die and he had no other choice. So at that point, he decided to go into Gladiator, but they each kind of took different paths. Like I kind of feel like Empire of Silence went the more Gladiator route, like the movie Gladiator, where he's like tries to help train people to be better fighters. Whereas in Will of the Many, it is a very much like this guy's out for himself. He's a very much about himself rather than trying to build up this community. And he was definitely one of the better fighters, and he could have become a leader for these people if he had wanted to, but he decided he didn't. He wanted to keep his heads down. You know, and in some ways in Empire of Silence, Hadrian was trying to keep his head down, but to some extent he also wasn't. He knew that plenty of time had passed. The planet he was on was far from his home planet, and he was just doing what he needed to do to survive. I thought the most interesting part about The Will of the Many was actually the very ending of the book, and this kind of like catastrophe that seems to happen on a regular basis with this wreck of a building or ruin of a building that they go and explore. And to me, that was the most interesting. It did really make me reminded me of how the Gideon the Ninth kind of felt, this decaying type society with just centuries of loss. And I hope that in the Strength of the Many, or Strength of the Few, which should be coming out soon, that's expanded on and is really fleshed out in a way that really pulls away from the trope-riddenness of the first book. And for the Empire of Silence, I already know that the second book I've started that book. I've decided to kind of bounce around a little bit more and decide more about what I'm thinking about reading. I don't really plan on doing videos about the sequel books unless it's like a wrap up of the series and maybe comparing two series together. But I just think it's probably going to be more interesting to do more, single standoff books or kind of other books together. I don't really think that there was anything, like these books didn't really feel earth-shattering. They were good, entertaining books. I don't think that The Will of the Many is going to last. I think it's going to fall down on the list pretty quickly unless the sequels keep it up. It was just too paint-by-numbers writing. It was fine. I mean, I enjoyed it. I deeply enjoyed it. But from a critical standpoint, it was not the best end-all be-all of books. It was okay. And I hope that he continues to improve his writing, because I get it. It's easy as a writer, piggybacking off of an existing type of story or leveraging something like that reduces the burden of doing the writing, so you can focus on character. And but I didn't really think the character work was made up for the fact that it was so driven by tropes. So I'm going to leave it there at that point. And feel free to leave some comments down below about what you thought, if you disagree with my analysis of these books, if you think that was being a little bit too harsh. I mean, I plan on reading the sequel for The Strength of the Few, and I plan on reading The Howling Dark. Maybe I will talk about them again together as follow-up books to books that were very, very much influenced by their respective genres. So anyway, I appreciate your time. If you want to hear more and see my other videos, please subscribe. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good one.